You don't get a vote in this house anymore, old man. Half the time you don't even remember what day it is. Ask anyone here. Bradley said it standing 3 feet from his mother's funeral flowers, still in the black suit he'd worn to bury her 4 hours earlier, and he said it loud enough that the whole reception heard it. The room went still in the particular way a room goes still when something has broken that cannot be unbroken. Nobody coughed. Nobody set down a coffee cup. Somewhere in the kitchen, the ice maker dropped a cube into an empty tray, and the sound of it hitting plastic was the loudest thing in the house. I stood there in my own living room, in front of 40 people who had come to mourn my wife, and I understood in that instant exactly what I had become to my son, not a father. A chair somebody had decided to pull out from under a man who was still leaning on it, expecting him to fall before he even understood he'd been pushed. My name is Walter Coyle. I am 63 years old. I spent 38 years as a title abstractor for Colby County, the man who sat in the recorder's office basement pulling deed books off steel shelves, tracing chains of ownership back through wars and divorces and dead men's handwriting, until a piece of land's whole legal history sat clean and provable in front of me. It is not a job anyone writes songs about. But I want you to understand something about it before this story goes any further. A house is not the walls. A house is not even the address. A house is a chain of paper, link by link, and if you don't know every link in that chain, you don't actually know who owns anything at all. My son did not know that. He had never once needed to know it, because for 48 years I had made every hard thing in his life quietly disappear before he had to feel its weight. That ends here. That ends with what happened on a Friday afternoon in September, 5 days after I buried my wife, when I drove home from the pharmacy with her unused prescriptions still in a paper bag on the passenger seat and found that the key in my own front door no longer turned. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and if I've learned anything in 4 decades of piecing together broken chains of title, it's that you tell the story in the order the documents were actually recorded, not the order that makes you look best. So let me take you back to Monday, the day of the funeral, because everything that came after was already sitting there in that room, waiting. Eleanor died on a Wednesday in early September, in the bedroom she and I had shared for 41 years. With her hand in mine and the window cracked open the way she liked it even in the cold months, because she said a room needed to breathe. The cancer had taken its slow, unhurried time with her, 11 months from diagnosis to the end. Long enough that we'd had time to say what needed saying and short enough that neither of us ever really believed it until the last week arrived, and there was no more room left for disbelief. I will not walk you through all 11 months. Some things belong only to the 2 people who live them. What I will tell you is this. In the last clear week she had, before the medication took the sharp edges off her mind, Eleanor asked me to bring her the wooden box from the top shelf of the hall closet, the one with the brass clasp that had belonged to her father. She wrote something inside it that night, sealed in an envelope with my name on it in her looping school teacher's handwriting, and she made me promise not to open it until I needed it. I didn't ask what that meant. You don't argue with a dying woman's instructions. You just nod, and you put the box back on the shelf, and you carry the weight of not knowing until the day arrives when you do. The funeral was on Monday. Colby Street Presbyterian, the church Eleanor's father had helped build the fellowship hall for back in 1961, standing room only by the time the service started, because Eleanor Coyle had spent 30 years teaching 3rd grade at Colby Elementary, and there is no shortage of grown men and women in that county who still remember the way she read to them after lunch on rainy days. I sat in the front pew between my son Bradley and my granddaughter Casey, and I do not remember most of what the minister said, because I was doing the thing you do at a funeral when your chest has a hole in it the exact shape of another person. I was holding very still and breathing very carefully and hoping nobody expected me to speak, because I did not trust my voice to survive it. Bradley is 48. He manages regional sales for a restaurant supply company out of Cedar Falls, and he has the particular gift some men have of walking into any room and making you feel, within 30 seconds, that whatever he wants from you is the most reasonable request in the world. His wife Renee is a real estate agent, sharp and polished, the kind of woman who can compliment your kitchen while quietly pricing it. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me more than it probably should, given everything that follows. I loved my son completely for 48 years, and some part of me still does. The way you love the boy he used to be, even after you've stopped trusting the man he became. That's not a contradiction. That's just what it costs to be a parent long enough. The reception was at our house afterward, the house on Whitcomb Road that Eleanor's father had carved out of his own farmland for us in 1978, the year we married and moved in with a mattress on the floor and $1,100 in a savings account. 41 years in that house. I had replaced the roof twice, rebuilt the porch after the flood of '96, and dug the trench for the septic line myself. The summer Bradley turned 9 because we couldn't afford to hire it out. 40 people stood in my living room that Monday afternoon eating casseroles other people's hands had made, and I moved through the crowd on autopilot, accepting condolences, refilling the coffee urn, doing the small mechanical tasks that keep a man upright when the alternative is sitting down somewhere and not getting up again. It was somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, with the crowd still thick and the light coming gold through the front windows the way it does in early September, that Bradley found me in the kitchen and asked if we could talk. Not later, he said. Now, while everyone's still here, it's better if everyone hears it together. I should have known from that sentence alone. A man who wants an audience for a family conversation is not looking for a conversation. He's looking for a verdict nobody in the room will feel comfortable arguing with. He walked me into the living room, put a hand on my shoulder in front of the fireplace where Eleanor's photograph sat surrounded by white lilies, and he raised his voice just enough that the room's chatter dropped away on its own, the way a crowd quiets when it senses something is about to happen. "Dad," he said, and his voice had that smooth, rehearsed warmth I'd watched him use on customers my whole life. "I think it's time we talked honestly about what happens now. This house is a lot for one person. Mom handled things you never had to think about. The bills, the doctor's appointments, keeping track of what day it is. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's true. And somebody in this family has to be the one willing to say the true thing out loud." I felt my face go hot. 40 people were watching. Casey, my granddaughter, had gone very still by the fireplace with a coffee cup halfway to her mouth. Renee stood near the doorway with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between discomfort and satisfaction, the particular look of a woman watching a plan she'd helped build finally start moving under its own power. I said, "Bradley, this is not the day." And that is when he said it. Standing 3 feet from his mother's funeral flowers, in the black suit he'd worn to bury her that same morning, he looked me in the eye in front of every person who had come to grieve with us and said, "You don't get a vote in this house anymore, old man. Half the time you don't even remember what day it is. Ask anyone here." The silence that followed had a texture to it. I could hear the mantel clock, the one Eleanor's mother had given us as a wedding present, ticking through seconds that suddenly felt enormous. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator's ice maker dropped a single cube, and the sound of it landing was so loud in that stillness that I saw 2 people flinch. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a tissue, or cleared a throat, or did any of the small covering things a room does when it wants to pretend it hasn't just witnessed something ugly. 40 people simply stood there and watched a son tell his father, 4 hours after burying his mother, that he no longer counted. I did not cry. I want you to understand that, because I think it matters. I did not shout either. I stood very still, the way you stand when you've just been told a piece of information you need a moment to file correctly, and I felt something in my chest go quiet and cold, in a way grief alone had never made it go. Grief is loud. It claws. What moved through me in that living room was different, measured, deliberate. The feeling of watching a number stop, making sense and understanding, with total clarity, that you are going to have to recount everything from the beginning. Casey set her coffee cup down on the mantel with a small, careful click, the first sound anyone in that room had dared make since Bradley's sentence finished landing. "Dad," she said quietly to her father, "that's not okay." That's not Grandpa just buried Grandma this morning. Bradley didn't look at her. He looked at me, and something in his jaw tightened. The look of a man who had said the thing he'd planned to say, and was now watching it cost more than he'd budgeted for. We can talk details later, he said, his voice dropping back into that smooth managerial register. Today isn't the day to get into logistics. I just wanted everyone to understand where things stand. So there's no confusion going forward. Where things stand. As though my life were a quarterly sales report he was walking the room through. I looked at my son for a long moment, and underneath the anger, and there was anger, plenty of it, sitting low and banked like coal, I felt something older and sadder rising alongside it. I thought about a boy of 9 holding a flashlight for me in a septic trench because he wanted to help. I thought about driving him to baseball tryouts at 5 in the morning for 3 summers straight because the good coach only ran early sessions. I thought about how a person spends 48 years building toward a son, brick by brick, the way you build toward anything that matters, and how none of that guarantees the building holds. The reception limped on for another hour after that. People left earlier than they would have otherwise, murmuring condolences at the door with the particular awkwardness of guests who have just watched something they were not meant to see. Casey stayed to help clean up, moving through the kitchen with quick, angry motions, stacking plates harder than she needed to. Bradley and Renee left around 5, Bradley clasping my hand at the door and saying, "We'll talk this week, Dad," like nothing at all unusual had happened, like he hadn't just detonated something in front of 40 witnesses and walked away from the blast radius without a mark on him. I want to tell you now about the thing I did next, because it matters to everything that follows, and because I think it's the part of this story where you'll start to understand who I actually am underneath the quiet. After the last guest left, and Casey had gone home to her own apartment across town, I stood alone in my living room in the failing light with Eleanor's photograph on the mantel and the smell of 40 people's casseroles still hanging in the air. And instead of sitting down and letting the day finally break me the way it wanted to, I walked to the hall closet. I took down the wooden box with the brass clasp. I had promised Eleanor I would not open it until I needed it. I stood there for a long moment with my thumb on the clasp, telling myself I did not yet need it, that this was grief talking, that Bradley's cruelty was a bad day compounding a worse one and not yet the kind of emergency Eleanor had been imagining when she sealed that envelope. But there was a small, steady voice underneath the grief, the same voice that used to tell me, 30 feet down in a courthouse basement, that a deed book was misfiled before I'd consciously noticed anything wrong. And that voice told me plainly that I already knew. I had known since the words left Bradley's mouth in front of the fireplace. This was the day. I did not open the envelope that night. I want to be honest with you about that, because this is not a story where every piece falls into place with perfect convenience. I set the box on the kitchen table, made myself a cup of tea I did not drink, and sat in the dark for a long time listening to a house that had never, in 41 years, been quiet in exactly this particular way. Somewhere around midnight, I finally went up to bed, alone on my side of it for the first time in 4 decades, and I did not sleep so much as I waited for morning with my eyes closed. What I want you to hold on to, moving forward, is this: on Monday, my son humiliated me in front of 40 mourners on the day of his mother's funeral, and I said almost nothing back. I let him have that moment. Not because I was weak, though I understand if that's what it looked like from the doorway. I let him have it because some part of me, the same part that had spent 38 years learning to read documents before reacting to them, understood that Bradley had just shown me his whole hand 4 days before he thought the game had even started. A man who is confident he has already won does not need to raise his voice. Bradley raised his, which told me, more clearly than anything else could have, that some part of him already suspected he hadn't won anything at all, and was trying to bury that doubt under enough volume that nobody, including himself, would hear it. I did not yet know about the second deed. I want to be honest about that too. I did not know that Monday night exactly what Eleanor had written in the envelope in the wooden box, though I had a growing, uneasy sense that it connected to something her father had done decades earlier, something I had helped file myself back when I was young enough to still believe paperwork was just paperwork and not, sometimes, the last quiet act of protection a person can leave behind for the people they love. What I did know, lying awake that night with my wife 4 days in the ground and my son's voice still echoing off my own living room walls, was that Bradley had made a mistake he did not yet understand he'd made. He had told a title abstractor of 38 years, in front of 40 witnesses, that his father no longer had a vote in his own house. I was going to make absolutely certain he found out exactly how wrong he was. Friday came 4 days later, and it came with its own kind of violence. Not loud, not a fist through a wall, but the particular quiet violence of a key that used to fit a lock and suddenly doesn't. I want to walk you through that day carefully, because everything I did afterwards started right there, on my own front porch, in the clothes I'd worn to bury my wife's unused prescription bottles back to the pharmacy that had filled them. He locked me out of my own house on a Friday afternoon. And the strange thing, the thing I keep coming back to, even now, is how ordinary the day looked right up until the moment it wasn't. I had driven into town that morning to return 4 unopened bottles of Eleanor's pain medication to the pharmacy, because that is the kind of small, brutal errand a person does not think to warn you about when they hand you a book on grief. The pharmacist behind the counter had known Eleanor for 15 years. She took the bottles from me without a word, just a nod and a hand briefly on top of mine, and I was grateful for that silence in a way I don't think I could have explained to her. I drove home the long way, out past the Whitcomb land, the way I always did when I needed the extra 10 minutes. Past the tree line where Eleanor's father used to run cattle before he sold most of the acreage off in the 70s, keeping only the 12 acres that would eventually become our home place. I want to tell you something about that drive, because it's the moment I'm least proud of in this whole story, and I promised myself when I started telling it that I would not clean myself up for you. For 4 days after the funeral, I had not once sat down at my own kitchen table. I want you to understand that this was not an accident. Eleanor's chair sat at the east end of the table, angled slightly toward the window the way she liked it, so she could watch the birds at the feeder while she ate. And every single time I walked into that kitchen, my eyes went to that chair before I could stop them, and something in my chest closed up so hard I had to leave the room. So for 4 days I had eaten standing at the counter, plate balanced on the edge of the sink, my back to the table entirely, the way a man avoids a down power line he knows is still live, even though nobody's told him so. I am 63 years old, and I had spent 38 years reading legal documents for a living without my hands ever once shaking, and I could not make myself sit down at my own kitchen table because a woman I loved was no longer in the chair beside it. I tell you this not because it belongs in a story about deeds and locks and a son's betrayal, but because I think you should know that the man who did everything I'm about to describe was not made of stone. He was a man standing at his own kitchen counter 4 days after burying his wife, eating a sandwich he couldn't taste, because sitting down felt like agreeing that she was really gone. So, Friday, I pulled into the driveway a little after 2 in the afternoon, gravel crunching under the tires the way it had for 41 years, and I noticed before I'd even put the car in park that something about the front door looked wrong. It took me a moment to place it. The brass kickplate at the bottom was scuffed in a way it hadn't been that morning. A fresh, bright scrape across old tarnish, the unmistakable mark of a deadbolt installation done in a hurry by someone who didn't much care about the finish work. I walked up the porch steps with the pharmacy receipt still folded in my jacket pocket, put my key in the lock the way I had done perhaps 30,000 times across 4 decades, and it would not turn, not stuck, not swollen from humidity the way old wood sometimes gets in September. It simply did not fit. A new lock, a new key, a door that no longer recognized the hand that had opened it every single day since Ronald Reagan was in his first term. I stood there for what must have been a full minute, key in hand, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as the sensation of the ground, shifting slightly underneath a foundation you'd have sworn was solid bedrock. Then I did what I imagine most men would do. I knocked. Nobody answered, though I could hear, faintly, movement inside. a drawer sliding shut, footsteps on the hardwood in the front hall, the particular creak of the third stair tread that had needed fixing for 15 years and that I had simply never gotten around to. I called Bradley's cell phone standing on my own porch like a stranger asking to be let into a house that was not his. It rang 4 times before he picked up, and when he did, his voice had that same smooth, managed quality it always carried when he was in the middle of doing something he knew he'd have to defend. "Dad," he said before I'd said a word. "I was going to call you today anyway. I'm standing on my own porch, Bradley, and my key doesn't work." A pause, and in it I could hear Renee's voice somewhere in the background, low and urgent, the particular register people use when they're coaching someone through a conversation from 6 feet away. Then Bradley again, steadier now, like he'd found his footing. "We had the locks changed for safety," he said. "After what happened Monday, Dad, you weren't yourself. You know that. Everyone at the funeral saw it. I talked to a lawyer this week, and he said, until we get a proper evaluation done, it's actually safer for everyone, including you, if the house stays secured and we figure out a stable plan going forward." I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, the way I had to sit with it, standing on the porch where I had once taught a 9-year-old boy to ride a bicycle. Everyone, including you. As though locking a grieving man out of the house he had paid for across 4 decades was an act of tenderness. As though I should have been grateful. I did not raise my voice. I have thought many times since about why I didn't, and I believe the answer is simply that 38 years of a career spent finding the quiet, buried error in a stack of documents had trained something into me that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with patience. I had learned, long before Bradley was ever born, that the man who reacts first is very rarely the man who wins the argument that matters. I said, "Bradley, I need to get my medication and a change of clothes. Can you at least let me in for that?" "Not today," he said. "Today's not a good day. We'll figure out logistics this week, I promise." "Give it a few days, Dad." He hung up before I could answer, and I stood alone on my own porch in this September afternoon with a locked door in front of me and a pharmacy receipt in my pocket for medicine that no longer had anyone left to take it, and something in me that had been quiet since Monday finally stopped being quiet. I did not break a window. I want to be very clear about that, because I know exactly what this story could have become if I'd let the anger drive instead of the patience, and I am not interested in telling you a story about a man who lost control. I walked back down the porch steps, got in my car, and drove across the street to Gordon Alvarez's house, because Gordon had retired from the Postal Service 11 years earlier, and had spent his retirement, as far as I could tell, cultivating 2 hobbies with equal devotion: a vegetable garden that regularly embarrassed the rest of the street, and a security camera system he'd installed himself after a rash of mailbox vandalism a few summers back, one that covered a clean, wide angle of both his own driveway and mine. Gordon opened the door before I'd finished knocking, took one look at my face, and said, "Walter, you look like a man who needs to sit down before he says whatever he came to say." I told him I'd rather stand if it was all the same to him, and I told him what had happened. Not everything, not yet. I hadn't told anyone everything yet. Not even myself. But the lock, the phone call, the phrase "everyone, including you." Gordon listened the way he always had, without interrupting, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've had a feeling about that boy for a while now. Come on in. I keep 30 days of footage." We sat at his kitchen table. His wife had passed 6 years earlier, and I think some part of both of us understood, without saying it, that this was 2 widowers doing each other a quiet kindness. Neither one would ever describe out loud as such, and he pulled up footage on a laptop that looked older than his youngest grandchild. Wednesday afternoon, 2 days after the funeral, a locksmith's van in my driveway for 40 minutes. Thursday morning, Renee's car parked at the curb for nearly 2 hours. Renee herself, walking in and out of the house 4 separate times carrying boxes, moving with the brisk, purposeful efficiency of a woman conducting an inventory rather than paying a condolence visit. And then, near the end of Thursday's footage, something that made the back of my neck go cold. A car I didn't recognize, dark gray, parked behind Renee's for almost 20 minutes. A man got out, trim, silver-templed, wearing the kind of blazer that costs more than it looks like it should, and he did not go inside. He stood at the edge of the driveway with Renee, the two of them talking with their heads close together, and at one point he handed her a folder, thick, the kind of folder that holds more than a single sheet of paper. "Do you know him?" Gordon asked. I did not, but I photographed the frozen frame on my own phone from Gordon's screen, the way you photograph a piece of evidence you don't yet understand the shape of, and I want you to remember that man's face, because he is going to matter a great deal more than either Gordon or I understood, sitting in that kitchen on a Friday evening with 2 cold cups of coffee going untouched between us. There is a particular kind of clarity that settles over you once shock burns off and something more useful takes its place. I drove home that night, not to my own house, which I could no longer enter, but to the small rental unit above Casey's garage that she insisted I take without argument the moment I called her and told her what had happened. And I lay awake with my hands folded on my chest, doing the thing 38 years of title work had trained into me without my ever asking for the skill. I started building the chain, link by link. What do I actually know, and in what order did it happen? I knew that Bradley had, at some point before Monday's funeral, already consulted a lawyer about my competency. I knew that a locksmith had come Wednesday, 2 days after the funeral, and mere hours, really, after I had stood in my own living room being told I no longer had a vote. I knew that Renee had spent Thursday moving through my house with the efficiency of someone taking stock of inventory, and that a well-dressed stranger with a thick folder had met her in my driveway to hand something over. And I knew, this was the piece that kept me awake longest, that none of this had the shape of a man overwhelmed by grief and stumbling into bad decisions. This had the shape of a plan that had already been drafted before Eleanor's casket was in the ground. Casey came up to the garage apartment the next morning with 2 coffees and a look on her face I hadn't seen since she was 19 and furious about something at college she wouldn't fully explain to me. "Grandpa," she said, sitting down across from me at the small table, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be mad that I didn't say it sooner." She'd overheard Renee on the phone 2 weeks before the funeral, before Eleanor had even passed, while Eleanor was still in hospice, talking to someone about, in Casey's words, getting things moving before it gets messy with probate. Casey hadn't understood what it meant at the time. She'd assumed it was ordinary estate planning talk, the kind families sometimes have to have even while someone is still alive, ugly as that sounds. But she'd also heard a name, Curtis. She thought it was Curtis Vane, though she wasn't entirely sure of the last name, and she remembered it specifically because Renee had said it the way you say a name you've said 100 times before, not the way you introduce someone new. I want to tell you that I recognized the name instantly, that some instinct fired, and I understood everything in that moment. I did not. What I understood, sitting in that small apartment with my granddaughter's hand wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking, was only that the timeline had just gotten longer and darker than a man locking his father out 4 days after a funeral. This had been in motion for weeks, at minimum, while Eleanor was still breathing in the next room. I called my attorney that same morning. Marion Whitfield had handled my affairs for 19 years, ever since a boundary dispute with a neighbor over a fence line that I, given my profession, had actually been better equipped to resolve than most of her other clients, which is precisely why she and I had gotten along so well from the start. She never once had to explain to me what a meets and bounds description meant. She listened to the whole account without interrupting, the way good attorneys do, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment. "Walter," she said finally, "I want you to do 3 things this week, and I want you to do them in order, because order is going to matter if this turns into what I think it might turn into. First, get a letter from Dr. Ferris confirming you're of sound mind, dated, signed, on file before anyone else gets the chance to claim otherwise in writing. Second, do not contact Bradley or Renee again except through me. Not because you did anything wrong, but because I don't want a single word out of your mouth twisted into evidence of instability. And third," she paused here, and I could hear papers shifting on her end of the line, I want you to think very carefully about whether there's anything in your own records, anything from Eleanor's family, that touches that property. Because a locksmith changing locks 4 days after a funeral doesn't happen without someone believing they already have the paperwork to back it up. I need to know what paperwork they think they have, and I need to know what paperwork actually exists. I did not tell her about the wooden box that night. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me was still holding on to the promise I'd made Eleanor, not to open it until I needed it, and some smaller, more frightened part of me was afraid of what I might find inside, or worse, afraid of what I might not find. It is one thing to suspect your son is capable of cruelty. It is another thing entirely to go looking for proof that your late wife knew it too, and had been quietly preparing for it before you ever saw it coming yourself. Dr. Ferris saw me Monday morning, exactly 1 week after the funeral, and the examination took less than 20 minutes because there was, in truth, nothing to find. He wrote the letter himself, 2 clean paragraphs, dated and signed, and handed it to me across his desk with an expression that told me he already suspected exactly why I needed it. "Whatever's happening, Walter," he said, "you fight it. You hear me. I've known you and Eleanor since before Bradley could walk. And this isn't right." That same week, working from the small desk in Casey's garage apartment, with nothing but a laptop and 38 years of knowing precisely where to look, I began pulling what public records I could reach. It did not take long to find the first piece. A civil judgment filed in Cedar Falls County 8 months earlier against Bradley Coyle in the amount of $61,000, the collapsed remains of a franchise restaurant he had opened 3 years prior with a business loan he had personally guaranteed. The restaurant had closed within 18 months. The loan had not closed with it. I found a second filing after that, smaller, $22,000 owed to a commercial lender, a balloon payment structure with the full remaining balance due. I sat back hard in my chair when I found the date, in 30 days. 28 days now from the morning I was reading it. I want you to understand what that number did to me, not the money itself. I had by then stopped being surprised by anything involving my son's finances. It was the date. 30 days from a balloon payment he could not make explained, with a clarity that made my stomach turn, exactly why a lock had been changed 2 days after his mother's funeral instead of 2 months after. My son was not simply grieving badly. My son was drowning. And somewhere in the space of that private failing, one of the deepest, ugliest thoughts a person can have had apparently taken root and grown. That his parents' house, the one thing in this world that had never once let him down, was worth more to him unoccupied and sellable than it was worth with his own father still living in it. I sat at that small desk for a long time after finding the balloon payment date, and I thought about Bradley at 9 years old, holding a flashlight steady in a septic trench, because he wanted to help his father with something hard. I thought about how a boy like that becomes a man capable of standing in front of his mother's funeral flowers and telling his father he no longer counted. I did not find an answer that satisfied me. I don't think there is one. Some things simply happen to people over the course of a life. Slowly, the way rust happens to a hinge nobody oils, until one day the door swings wrong and everyone acts surprised, though the wear had been visible for years to anyone willing to look closely. That night, alone in the garage apartment, with Casey asleep downstairs in the main house, I finally took the wooden box out of the bag I'd carried it in since Monday and set it on the small kitchen table in front of me. Eleanor's handwriting on the envelope. My name, nothing else. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be. I want you to know that when I finally broke the seal on that envelope, I was not looking for a weapon. I was looking for my wife's voice, one more time, in whatever form she'd chosen to leave it for me. What I found inside was not the letter. Not yet. Folded behind the sealed envelope, tucked flat against the bottom of the box where I might easily have missed it if I hadn't spent 38 years training my hands to feel for exactly this kind of thing, was a single yellowed receipt from the Colby County Recorder's Office, dated March of 1996, marked paid in full for a recording fee of $40. The document type listed in cramped clerk's shorthand I recognized instantly from my own years behind that same counter. I sat at that small kitchen table for a long time before I did anything else, the receipt flat under my palm, feeling the particular vertigo of a man who has spent his entire career reading other families' secrets out of deed books and has just discovered, at 63, that his own wife had recorded one of her own without ever once mentioning it across 23 years of marriage that followed Book 412, page 89. I knew the recorder's office in Colby County the way most men know the layout of their own kitchen. I had spent 38 years down in that basement archive room, and even after they digitized most of the modern records, the pre-2000 volumes still sat exactly where they always had, on steel shelving that smelled permanently of old paper and the particular mineral dust that seemed to live in courthouse basements the way dust lives nowhere else. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in the dark, running the calculation over and over, the way you check a sum 3 times when the answer matters more than usual, trying to remember anything at all, from March of 1996 that might explain why my wife had gone to that office alone and recorded a document she never told me about. I remembered, slowly, across the sleepless hours, that March of 1996 was the same month Eleanor's father, Frank Whitcomb, had passed away. He'd died quietly in his sleep at 81 on the same 12 acres he'd farmed his whole life, having sold off the bulk of his land back in the 70s but keeping the parcel that would become our home place, plus a smaller 5-acre strip behind it, pond, woods, and the old well house that he'd never developed and never sold, and that I had always simply assumed, in the lazy way you assume things about property that isn't formally yours to think about, had passed to Eleanor along with the rest of his modest estate. I remembered that Eleanor had handled all of it herself, the paperwork, the small estate, insisting I didn't need to be involved because I dealt with deeds all day at work, and she wanted, in her words, one thing in this family that was hers to manage without my red pen all over it. I had laughed at the time. I had thought it was a small, sweet act of independence from a woman who rarely asked for anything just for herself. I had never once wondered what else might have happened inside that independence. I went to the recorder's office the following morning, the first Tuesday after the funeral, wearing a collared shirt out of some old habit of respect for the building itself, and I asked Denise at the front counter. She'd started there 11 years after I did and had outlasted my own retirement by 3, to pull Book 412 from the pre-digital archive. She didn't ask why. In a county that's small, everyone already half knew, the way small counties always do, that something had gone wrong out at the old Coyle place. The book was heavier than I remembered them being, or maybe I was simply weaker than I used to be, grief taking more out of a body than a person likes to admit. I found page 89 with hands that were not by then entirely steady, and I sat down at the long research table under the fluorescent lights and read, for the first time in my life, a legal instrument my late wife had recorded in complete privacy 28 years earlier. It was exactly what the receipt had promised, and it was more than I had let myself hope for. A life estate deed, drafted and recorded by Eleanor alone in March of 1996, covering the 5-acre rear parcel of the Whitcomb land, the pond, the woods, the old well house, and, critically, the 60-foot gravel easement that ran directly through that parcel and served as the only vehicle access to the main house where Bradley had changed my locks 4 days after burying his mother. Eleanor had inherited that 5 acres outright from her father's estate, free and clear, hers alone under Ohio law regardless of our marriage, and instead of simply holding it or folding it quietly into our shared property the way most people would have, she had gone to this very office by herself and recorded a life estate naming me, Walter James Coyle, as life tenant, with full and irrevocable right to occupy, access, and use the parcel, including the easement, for the remainder of my natural life, remainder interest, passing only after my death to our then living descendants in equal shares. I read it 3 times. Then I sat very still under the fluorescent lights with the old deed book open in front of me and felt something break loose in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a grief so specific and so tender that I had to put my hand flat on the page for a moment just to steady myself. My wife, 28 years earlier, alone without telling me, had quietly built a wall around the one thing she could not have known back then that I would ever need protecting from our own son, decades before he became the man capable of locking me out. She had not done it because she distrusted Bradley in 1996. Bradley had been 20 years old. That spring, still mostly a boy, nothing in him yet that would have given her cause. I believe, and I will believe this until the day I die, that Eleanor did it simply because her father had taught her that land is the one promise you can make stick even after you're not there anymore to keep it yourself. And she had wanted, in her own quiet and unannounced way, to make sure that whatever happened to either of us in this life, I would never be a man standing outside a locked door with nowhere left that was legally unshakably mine. Here is the piece that made my hands finally go still on that page instead of shaking: the easement. Whoever held that recorded life estate held not merely the 5 back acres, the woods and the pond nobody but us and the deer ever walked through. They held the only legal right of vehicle access across that strip of land to reach the driveway of the main house itself. Bradley, in his rush to secure the front parcel, in whatever paperwork Renee and the man named Curtis had assembled and handed my son to sign, had almost certainly done exactly what a man in a hurry always does. He had focused entirely on the house, on the visible thing, the thing with a mailbox and an address and a for sale sign he could picture in the yard. He had never once, in all his planning, thought to check the chain of title on the 5 acres behind it, because as far as he knew, as far as anyone in this family besides Eleanor, and now me, had ever known, that back parcel was simply part of the property, unremarkable, unencumbered, nothing worth a second look. He was wrong. And I now had the recorded page number to prove it. I want to tell you, honestly, that my first feeling, sitting in that archive room, was not triumph. It was something closer to the particular grief of realizing, all at once, how much your spouse loved you in ways you never got the chance to thank her for while she was alive. I sat there long enough that Denise eventually came over and asked, gently, if I needed anything, and I told her I was fine. And she left me alone the way people in small towns know how to do. When a man needs a moment, nobody else should witness. I called Marion Whitfield from the courthouse steps 20 minutes later, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. I told her everything: the receipt, the book, the page, the easement, the 28 years of silence Eleanor had kept about the whole thing. There was a long pause on her end of the line, long enough that I asked if she was still there. "I'm here, Walter," she said finally. "I'm just sitting with how remarkable your wife was." And then, in the same breath, in the crisp professional register I'd hired her for in the first place, "This changes everything about our timeline, and I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because how we handle the next 2 weeks is going to determine whether this ends in your favor cleanly, or whether it ends in a courtroom that drags on for a year and costs you money and dignity you don't need to spend. We do not confront Bradley with this yet. We verify it, we shore it up, and we let him keep making mistakes on a foundation he doesn't know is already cracked. Do you understand?" I told her I understood completely. 38 years of watching men make confident decisions on top of documents they'd never actually read had taught me exactly how this worked. The man who moves first, loudly, is very rarely the man who wins. But there was still the sealed envelope. I had not opened it. I had found the receipt tucked behind it, pulled the deed book, spent the day confirming what my hands already suspected. And through all of it, Eleanor's actual letter had sat untouched at the bottom of the wooden box, because some part of me understood, without being able to explain it, that I was not yet ready to hear her voice on top of everything else that day had already asked of me. I opened it that night, alone in the garage apartment, with the lamp turned low the way she always kept lights low in the evenings, because she said harsh light made a house feel like a waiting room. Her handwriting filled 2 pages, front and back, dated the same week she'd asked me to bring her the box, the last clear week she had before the medication blurred the edges of her mind. I am not going to give you every word of it. Some things, as I said, belong only to the 2 people who lived them, and I intend to keep that promise even now, telling you the rest of this story. But I will tell you what she wrote near the end. because it matters to everything that happened after, and because I think about it every single day since. She wrote that she had watched, over the last several years, the way money worry had started to change something in Bradley. Not the whole of him. She was careful to say, never the whole of him, but a hardness creeping in around the edges, the way frost creeps in around a window pane before you notice winter has actually arrived. She wrote that she did not know, could not know, what shape that hardness might eventually take, and that she was not writing to accuse her son of anything he had not yet done. She wrote only this, and I have read it enough times now that I can recite it without looking. Walter, I have watched love in this family get mistaken for ownership before, in my own father's generation, and I promised myself it would not happen again in ours. Whatever you find in that back parcel, know that I did not do it because I stopped trusting our son. I did it because I never wanted you to need anyone's permission to still have a home. That was all. No prophecy, no name of a lawyer, or a lock, or a locksmith's van in a driveway. Just a mother's plain, general fear about money and hardness and the slow way love can curdle into control if nobody's watching closely enough to stop it. Written years before any of the rest of it happened. True, the way a worry is true long before it becomes a fact. I set the letter down on the small table, and I did the thing I had not let myself do since Wednesday morning. Standing at my own kitchen counter eating a sandwich I couldn't taste. I put my head down on my folded arms and I cried, finally, for my wife, for the 28 years of silence she'd kept to protect me, for the boy with the flashlight in the septic trench who had somehow become a man capable of what he'd become, and for the particular exhausted relief of a man who has spent a week holding himself together by sheer will finally being allowed, for one private hour in a garage apartment with the lamp turned low, to simply come apart. Cassie found me there the next morning, and she did not ask questions. She made coffee, sat across from me, and waited, the way her grandmother had taught her without either of them ever calling it a lesson. When I finally told her what the box contained, her eyes went wide, and then slowly, hard in a way that reminded me so much of Eleanor at that age that it nearly started me crying all over again. "Grandpa," she said, "does Dad know any of this exists?" I told her the truth. I did not believe he did. I believed, based on everything Gordon's camera had shown to me and everything the public record now confirmed, that Bradley and Renee had spent weeks, possibly longer, building a plan around a single deed, the one covering the house itself, the one that listed Eleanor and me as joint tenants with right of survivorship, the one that would have, on paper, passed cleanly and entirely to me alone the moment Eleanor died, requiring nothing more than my own signature to transfer, sell, or otherwise dispose of. That deed was real. It existed. It was in fact, exactly what Renee and her associates at Curtis Vane had almost certainly built their entire timeline around. Get the ailing, grieving widower to sign quickly, before he had time to think clearly, and the house converts cleanly into cash within weeks. What they did not know, what neither of them had ever thought to check because nobody in this family, besides Eleanor and now me, had ever had reason to look, was that the only road to that house ran through 5 acres they did not own, encumbered by a life estate recorded 28 years earlier that made my presence on that land not a courtesy Bradley could revoke with a locksmith, but a legal right no signature of mine, forced or otherwise, could ever have signed away even if I'd wanted to. I called Marion again that afternoon and told her about the letter, though I kept its private contents to myself the way I'm keeping most of them from you now. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about often since. "Walter, some people spend their whole lives building fences to keep threats out. It sounds like your wife spent one quiet afternoon in 1996 building a gate that only you would ever be able to open. That's not the same kind of love as flowers or anniversaries. That's the load-bearing kind. We spent the following week building the rest of the file, quietly, the way you build anything meant to hold weight." Marion confirmed the life estate's validity through a title search of her own, independent of mine. "Standard practice," she said, "for exactly this kind of situation." She wanted the finding to come from a source Bradley's attorney, whoever that turned out to be, could not dismiss as a grieving old man's wishful reading of an old document. She confirmed, too, something I had suspected but not yet proven, that the man in Gordon's driveway footage, the trim, silver-templed stranger with the expensive blazer, was almost certainly Curtis Vane, a self-styled legacy transition consultant who ran a small operation out of Cedar Falls advising families and, as it turned out, quietly taking a finder's percentage from the very same quick cash real estate buyers he steered his clients toward. Marion had heard the name before, she told me, from a colleague in probate court who'd handled the aftermath of at least one other family. Vane had walked through a strikingly similar sequence: grieving spouse, rushed signature, fast sale below market value, and a consulting fee buried in the paperwork that most families never noticed until it was far too late to matter. I thought about Bradley, drowning in a balloon payment now 21 days from due, sitting across a table from a smooth, well-dressed stranger who had almost certainly promised him a clean, fast, dignified solution to a problem he was too ashamed to admit to his own father. I thought about how easy it must have been for a man like Vane to make my son's desperation look to Bradley himself like responsible planning. I did not excuse what Bradley had done. I want to be clear about that. Grief does not excuse cruelty, and desperation does not excuse a locked door on the week you bury your mother. But I understood, sitting with all of it laid out in front of me, that my son was not merely a villain in this story. He was also, in his own way, a mark, a frightened man being handled by someone more practiced at this particular cruelty than Bradley could ever have imagined himself capable of joining. That understanding did not soften what I intended to do next. It only clarified it. Some debts, once you understand their true shape, become easier to collect, precisely because you finally know exactly where the weight is meant to fall. Casey came to me on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the funeral, with her own son Theo in tow, 6 years old, still in his school clothes, clutching a dinosaur he did not go anywhere without. And she told me something that would end up mattering more than either of us understood in that moment. Renee had called her that afternoon, casual, almost cheerful, to say the family was planning a small gathering at the house the following weekend to spread some of Eleanor's ashes at the pond behind the property, the spot Eleanor had always loved best, the one with the old bench her father had built by hand decades earlier. It's what Grandma would have wanted, Renee had said. A private family goodbye, out at the water. I sat very still when Casey told me that. Out at the water. The 5 acres, the pond, the exact parcel of land recorded in Book 412, page 89, under a life estate deed my son and his wife did not know existed, chosen, of all the places on earth, as the site where they intended to say their final goodbye to the woman who had quietly protected it for me, 28 years before any of us understood why she'd need to. I looked at Theo, sitting on the floor of Casey's living room, making his dinosaur walk slow circles around his own knee, and I thought about the letter in the wooden box, about love mistaken for ownership, about a woman who never wanted her husband to need anyone's permission to still have a home, and I understood, with the particular calm clarity that had carried me through 38 years of finding the one buried error in a stack of documents everyone else had already signed off on, exactly where this story was going to end. Not in a courtroom, if I could help it. Not even in anger, if I could manage to hold on to myself the way Eleanor always believed I could, at the water, where she'd asked to go home. The 8 days between Casey's phone call and the gathering at the pond were, in some ways, the busiest of my entire life, and in other ways they were the quietest, because most of what mattered during that stretch happened in rooms where nobody raised their voice at all. Marion Whitfield filed what she called a quiet notice, not a lawsuit, not yet, just a formal recorded assertion of the life estate interest, sent to the county and copied, with careful deliberateness, to an attorney Bradley had apparently retained the week of the funeral, a young man out of Cedar Falls named Preston Locke, who, Marion told me with the flat satisfaction of a woman who has done her homework, had exactly 4 years of experience and had never once in his short career handled a contested title matter. I want to explain why that mattered to her and to me, because I think it says something true about how these things actually get decided in the real world, away from the courtroom drama people imagine. A young, inexperienced attorney reading a recorded life estate deed, for the first time, does not see an obstacle he can argue his way around. He sees a landmine his client walked directly onto, and his very first instinct, 9 times out of 10, is not to fight. It's to find out how fast his client can walk it back before it costs everyone more than it already has. I did not hear from Bradley directly that week. I want you to understand what that silence cost me, because it is easy, telling a story like this after the fact, to sound like a man who felt nothing but resolve the whole way through. I did not. I checked my phone more times a day than I am willing to admit, half hoping for a text that simply said, "Dad, I'm sorry. Come home," and I never got one. What I got instead on the Tuesday before the gathering was a call from Renee, not Bradley. Her voice pitched into that same warm, managed register her husband had used on me a week earlier, informing me that everyone would be so glad to see me at the water on Saturday, that it was time for the family to come together and heal, that she hoped I understood. None of this was ever personal. It was simply about being practical during a difficult transition. I told her I would be there. I did not tell her why. Casey and I spent that same week doing something I had not expected to be doing 11 days after burying my wife, which was quietly, carefully reaching out to people. Not to recruit an audience, though I understand how it might look that way in hindsight. I want to be honest about my reasoning, because I think it matters. I had spent 38 years in a county where half the population had, at some point, needed a title cleared, a boundary confirmed, an old family dispute untangled from a deed book nobody else could read. And in every one of those years, whenever I could, I had done that work a little faster, a little more carefully, and more than a few times entirely for free, for people who could not otherwise afford to prove what was rightfully theirs. I had never once kept a ledger of those kindnesses. Eleanor used to tease me about it, gently, calling me the county's unpaid guardian angel of paperwork. I had never expected any of it to matter beyond the moment it happened. But word travels in a small county the way water finds its own level, quietly and without anyone directing it. By Thursday, 3 people had called me, unprompted. None of them asked. None of them told what to say. Simply to say they'd heard what was happening out at Whitcomb Road and wanted me to know they'd be thinking of me Saturday. One of them, a woman named Ruth Halloran, whose late husband's farm boundary I'd spent 6 unpaid Saturdays untangling nearly 20 years earlier, after a neighbor tried to claim 11 acres that were never his, told me flatly that she intended to be there, at the pond, standing at the tree line if that's what it took, because she said, and I remember the exact words, "Some debts don't expire just because the man who's owed them never asked to collect." I did not ask any of them to come. I want that understood clearly. What I did do on Friday evening was finally sit down with Casey and Theo and tell them, in plain language a 6-year-old could follow, some small piece of what had happened. Not the cruelty, not the locks, but the deed, the pond, the reason the water mattered so much more than anyone at Saturday's gathering understood yet. Theo listened with the particular solemn attention small children give to things they sense are important, even when they don't fully grasp why. And when I finished, he asked me a question that I have turned over in my mind every day since, because I do not think an adult in this story could have asked it half so clearly. "Grandpa," he said, "if you already loved Grandma's whole family, why did somebody have to write it down on paper for it to count?" I did not have a good answer for him that night. I still don't. Fully, though I have thought about it a great deal, and the closest I have come is this. Paper does not make love count. It only makes love enforceable, once the people who are supposed to honor it on their own stop being willing to. That's a hard thing to explain to a 6-year-old, and it's a harder thing to accept as a grown man who spent 38 years believing documents were simply the record of what people had already agreed to do right by each other. Saturday came in gray and still, the kind of early autumn morning where the light never quite fully arrives. Everything wrapped in a low mist that hadn't burned off by the time Marion and I turned onto Whitcomb Road just before 10. She had insisted on coming, not as an attorney making a scene, she'd been firm about that, but present, quiet, in case the day required her, and I was more grateful for that quiet presence than I think I told her at the time. Cars already lined the gravel shoulder near the house when we arrived. Bradley's truck. Renee's sedan. A rental car I didn't recognize that I would later learn belonged to Aunt Deborah, Eleanor's younger sister, flown in from Arizona for the ceremony, and parked slightly apart from the others, a dark gray sedan I recognized immediately from Gordon's footage, sitting at the edge of the driveway like a man too polished for the setting he'd chosen to stand in. We did not walk through the front door. There was, by then, no need. Marion and I walked the long way around the house, along the tree line, following the same worn path. Eleanor and I had walked 10,000 times across 41 years, down the gentle slope toward the pond where her father's old bench still sat weathered gray under the cottonwoods, and where perhaps 20 people had already gathered, standing in loose clusters in the mist, waiting for a ceremony that was, though almost none of them yet knew it, about to become something else entirely. Bradley saw me first. I watched something complicated move across his face, surprise, then something harder, then a visible effort to smooth it all back into the composed, managing expression he wore the way other men wear a coat. "Dad," he said, walking toward me with his hand already extended for a shake I did not offer. "I'm glad you came. I know things have been tense. Today's not the day for that, though. Today's for Mom." "I agree completely," I said, and I meant it, every word, in a way that I do not think Bradley understood in that moment, and would not understand for several more minutes yet. "Today is for your mother. I intend to honor that fully." Renee stood near the bench in a black coat, holding the small brass urn against her chest with both hands in a posture of careful, practiced grief that did not, to my eye, quite reach her eyes. Beside her, close enough that his presence made my jaw tighten before I could stop it, stood the man from Gordon's driveway footage, trim, silver-templed, blazer immaculate against the gray morning, introducing himself to Aunt Deborah as though he belonged there, as though he had any right at all to stand at the edge of a widow's ashes being scattered on land he had never once bothered to check the ownership of. Casey found my side, Theo's small hand in hers, and murmured, "That's him, isn't it?" The man from the driveway. I told her it was. I told her, quietly, to wait, that everything had its order, the way documents in a chain of title have their order, each one resting on the one recorded before it, and that today's order was going to matter more than any single moment inside it. The minister who had led Eleanor's funeral service the week before spoke first, brief and plain, and then Bradley stepped forward to say a few words about his mother, genuine words. I want to be fair, real grief in his voice as he spoke about her patience, her third-grade classroom, the way she'd always kept the porch light on for anyone who might be coming home late. I watched him standing there, my son, capable of that much real love in one breath, and the phrase everyone, including you, in the next, and I understood, more clearly than I had all week, that human beings are rarely only the worst thing they've done. That understanding did not soften what came next. It only made it heavier to carry. Renee stepped toward the water's edge with the urn, and it was in that exact moment, the pause before the ashes met the pond her father-in-law's father had dug by hand 70 years earlier, that Curtis Vane, standing slightly apart from the family cluster, leaned toward Renee and murmured something I was close enough to catch. "Once this part's done, we should walk the back parcel with the listing photographer before the light changes. Cash buyers already pre-approved on the acreage total, so we want clean shots of the water for the listing." I felt Marion's hand find my elbow, steady, a silent signal that said not yet, let it breathe. I held still. Renee tipped the urn. The ashes caught the mist and settled, pale. Across the surface of the water, Eleanor had loved more than almost any other place on this earth, and for one long moment nobody spoke at all, the whole gathering suspended in the particular silence a body makes when it is genuinely, fully grieving, before commerce and cruelty come crowding back in to fill the space grief had briefly cleared. It was into that silence that I finally stepped forward. "Bradley," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Standing at the edge of the water, where I had scattered so much of my own life across 4 decades. "Before anyone starts photographing this parcel for a listing, there's something you and everyone here need to understand about the ground you're standing on. This ground," I said, "is the 5 acres behind the main house, the pond, the woods, the well house, and the drive that brought every one of you here today. It was left to your mother alone by her father in 1996. Free and clear, hers to do with as she chose. And in March of that same year, alone without telling me, she went to the Colby County Recorder's office and had a life estate deed drawn up and recorded, naming me as life tenant of this exact parcel for the remainder of my natural life. Book 412, page 89. It has sat in the public record for 28 years, available to anyone who thought to look. The mist seemed to hold very still around us. I watched Bradley's face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. Not shock exactly, but the particular slow-motion collapse of a man watching a structure he'd built his whole plan on top of quietly reveal itself to have no foundation at all. "That's not possible," Renee said. "Too fast." The urn still cradled against her chest. "We pulled the title on this property. We had it reviewed. You pulled the title on the front parcel," Marion said, stepping forward and speaking for the first time, her voice calm and entirely without malice. The voice of a woman who has done this exact kind of correction items than she could count. The house parcel, the one with the mailbox. This 5 acres has always been a separate legal description, recorded separately, taxed separately, and it has an easement running through it that is the sole vehicle access to the house itself. "Whoever advised you on this transaction," she did not finish the sentence. She simply turned, deliberately, and looked at Curtis Vane. And I watched 20 faces turn with hers, all at once, toward a man who had, until that exact moment, been standing at the edge of a grieving family's ceremony as though he had every right in the world to be there. Vane's composure did not crack immediately. I will give him that much credit, and no more. He said something about a full due diligence having been performed, about title insurance covering exactly this kind of oversight. The smooth, professional deflection of a man who has clearly delivered some version of this same sentence before to some other family, standing at the edge of some other loss he'd found a way to profit from. It was Aunt Deborah who broke first, and I want to tell you about that moment carefully, because I did not expect it, and because I think it mattered more than almost anything I said myself that morning. Eleanor's sister had flown in from Arizona carrying, I would learn later, her own quiet grief and her own long-held doubts about Renee that she had never once voiced to anyone in the family. Out of the particular loyalty relatives extend even to people they privately distrust. She stepped forward now, directly into the middle of the gathering, her voice cutting across Vane's careful sentence before he could finish it. "I have sat through this entire week, listening to everyone talk about what's practical," she said, her voice shaking with something that was not sadness alone. "My sister is not even 2 weeks in the ground, and you people brought a real estate salesman to stand at the edge of her ashes." She turned to Bradley directly, and her voice cracked wide open. "Your mother taught 3rd grade for 30 years because she believed every single soul child deserved somebody who showed up for them without asking what they'd get in return. You are her son. Act like it." Nobody in that gathering moved for a long moment. Then, from the tree line behind us, I heard footsteps in the wet grass, and I turned to see Ruth Halloran and 2 others I recognized. A young mechanic named Dale, whose late father's fence dispute I'd untangled without charge back in 2009, and Eleanor's former teaching aide, a woman named Priya, who had driven 40 minutes that morning simply to stand quietly at the edge of the trees, walking down the slope to stand, not shouting, not saying a word, simply present, the way people stand together when they've decided without discussing it beforehand, that a thing happening in front of them is not going to happen unwitnessed. Bradley looked at them, then at his aunt. Then, finally, at me, and something in his face broke open in a way I had not seen since he was very young, long before any of this, long before debt and desperation, and a man in an expensive blazer had found the cracks in him and pried them wider. "Dad," he said, and his voice had none of the smooth managing tone left in it at all. "Is it true, what she said, about the deed?" "It's true," I said. "I have the recorded page. Marion has confirmed it independently. This 5 acres, and the only road to that house, have belonged to me for the rest of my life since 3 months before your 20th birthday. Your mother did that. Not to protect the house from you, Bradley. She did it because she'd watched money trouble curdle love into control before, in her own father's generation, and she never wanted me standing outside a locked door with nowhere left that was legally unshakably mine. She was right to worry. I just never imagined, until 11 days ago, that she'd been worrying about you. I want to tell you what happened in Bradley's face in the silence that followed, because I think it is the truest thing in this entire story. He did not argue. He did not reach for one more angle, one more version of the smooth sentence that had carried him through so many rooms across so many years. He simply stood there at the edge of his mother's water, with his shoulders coming down, slowly, like a man finally setting down something heavy he'd been carrying. So long he'd forgotten it had weight at all. "I'm in trouble," he said quietly, to me, to Renee, to the whole silent gathering. The confession landing with none of the polish it would have carried a week earlier. "I owe money I can't pay. I have 21 days left on a balloon payment I don't have. And instead of telling you, Dad, instead of coming to you like a grown man and saying I need help, I let myself believe that taking this house from you was somehow the responsible thing to do. I told myself I was protecting you. I wasn't. I was protecting myself, and I let this man, he did not look at Vane as he said it, could not quite bring himself to. I let him convince me that was the same thing." Renee's face had gone very pale. "Bradley," she started, but he held up a hand. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, she stopped. "I want you to hear something else here, because I do not want to tell you a story where I come out of this looking like a man with no faults of his own, standing in judgment of everyone else's." I stepped closer to my son, close enough that I could see the exact shade of gray starting at his temples, the same shade mine had gone 20 years earlier, and I said the thing I had not planned to say, the thing that had been sitting under my ribs since the morning. "Casey told me about the balloon payment." "I made mistakes too, Bradley," I said. "Not this week. Long before this week. I spent 48 years making every hard thing in your life quietly disappear before you had to feel the weight of it, because it was easier for me than watching you struggle. And I never once stopped to ask whether that was actually love, or whether it was just my own comfort wearing love's clothes. A man who never learns what a debt feels like sometimes grows up, believing debts are things other people are supposed to solve for him. I don't say that to excuse what happened this month. I say it because I think I helped build the floor you were standing on when you decided a locked door was easier than an honest conversation with your own father." Renee had gone very quiet. Vane had begun, slowly, edging toward the tree line. The particular retreat of a man who understands a room has turned against him and is calculating the fastest exit that doesn't look like flight. Marion caught his arm before he'd gone 3 steps, not roughly, just firmly, and said, in the same calm voice she'd used the whole morning, "I'd stay, if I were you. County prosecutor's office has been very interested lately in a pattern involving your name and at least 2 other families in Cedar Falls County. I imagine they'd rather hear your side of things in a room with a recorder running than have you disappear from a family's private memorial before anyone got your full name on the record. I will not pretend I know everything that happened to Curtis Vane in the weeks that followed. I know that Marion's colleague in probate court had, in fact, already begun quietly documenting a pattern. 3 families now, not 2, each one steered by Vane toward a fast, below-market cash sale during a period of acute grief, each one carrying a consulting fee buried deep enough in the paperwork that none of them had noticed it until long after the ink had dried. I know that the county eventually opened a formal inquiry. I know that Vane's name, by the following spring, had quietly disappeared from the letterhead of Legacy Bridge Advisors entirely. What I choose to remember most clearly from that morning at the water, though, is not his exit. It's the look on Bradley's face as he watched the man walk away. Not relief, not yet, but the particular exhausted recognition of someone finally understanding exactly how thoroughly he had been used by someone he trusted to be smarter than he was. The gathering did not end there, though I understand if you expected it to. I have thought a great deal, in the months since, about what it means that a story like this doesn't simply stop the moment the villain leaves the frame. Real life keeps going. The people left standing at the edge of the water that morning still had to figure out how to be a family again, or whether they could be one at all. We did not resolve everything that day. Renee left within the hour, quiet, her face unreadable, and I do not know, even now, exactly how much of what happened she had known, and how much she had simply allowed herself not to ask about too closely. That is not a question I am able to answer for her, and I have stopped trying. Bradley stayed. He sat down on his grandfather-in-law's old bench beside the pond, alone at first, and then slowly with Casey beside him, and finally, after a long while, with me. We did not have the whole conversation that afternoon. Grief and shame both take longer than a single afternoon to move through, honestly, and I am suspicious, now, of any story that claims otherwise. What we had instead was a beginning. Bradley told me haltingly the full shape of the debt, the restaurant, the loan, the balloon payment, the shame that had kept him from ever once, across 8 months of drowning, simply picking up the phone and telling his father the truth. I told him, in turn, something I had never said to him plainly in 48 years. That I would rather have watched him fail honestly in front of me 100 times than watch him succeed once by taking something that was never his to take. He cried at that. I am not embarrassed to tell you that I did too. Theo, who had spent most of the ceremony solemn and quiet at his mother's side, wandered over to the bench at some point during that long, unhurried conversation and climbed up between his grandfather and his great-grandfather, Dinosaur still clutched in one hand, and asked, with the particular fearless directness only a 6-year-old can manage, "Are you not mad at each other anymore?" Bradley looked at me before he answered. I nodded. Once, the way you nod at a question that deserves an honest answer, even from a very small person. We're working on it, Bradley told him. That's what families do, when they still love each other enough to bother. I want to close this out by telling you what happened in the weeks after, because I think you deserve to know that the ending here was not neat, and I have never trusted stories that pretend endings are ever entirely neat. Bradley did not walk away from his debts with a clean slate. There was no forgiveness large enough, and frankly none owed, to erase $61,000 in a balloon payment he still could not make. What he did, with Marion's careful guidance and my own reluctant but genuine help, was face it honestly for the first time, a structured repayment plan with the commercial lender, a bankruptcy filing on the restaurant debt that his attorney, young Preston Locke, actually handled competently once he understood there was no longer any deed dispute worth fighting over. I helped him with part of it, not all of it. I want to be honest about that distinction because I think it matters. I did not simply hand my son away out of the consequences of what he'd done. I stood beside him while he walked through them himself, the way I should have been doing all along, instead of quietly clearing his path before he ever had to feel the weight of walking it. The house locks were changed back within the week, this time by me, with Bradley's own hand helping turn the new deadbolt into place. An image I did not expect to find as moving as I did, watching my son do honest, humble work with his hands on the doorway he had once tried to seal me out of. I signed nothing away that autumn, and I want to be precise about the language here, because precision has been my whole profession and I am not going to abandon it now, at the very end of this story, for the sake of a tidier sentence. Bradley did not sign away an inheritance he had never actually owned. What he signed, in Marion's office in early November, with Casey and Theo, and eventually even Renee present, was an acknowledgement, formally witnessed and recorded, that he had been fully informed of the life estate and of the terms of the family trust. Eleanor and I had quietly updated years earlier, and an agreement not to contest either instrument going forward. I remain, as I always was, the one with the legal authority to decide what becomes of that land after I'm gone. Bradley did not lose an inheritance that afternoon. He simply, finally, understood the shape of the one he'd never actually held. I still eat breakfast standing at the kitchen counter most mornings. I want to tell you that the grief resolved itself neatly along with everything else, and it did not, and I don't believe it ever fully will. But some mornings now, more of them than there used to be, I sit down at the table instead, in my own chair, across from the one that still faces the window toward the bird feeder, and I let myself look at it instead of away from it. Some mornings Theo is there too, On the weekends, Casey brings him by, eating cereals across from Eleanor's empty chair, like it's simply part of the furniture of his life, which I suppose, to him it has always been. The wooden box with the brass clasp sits on my own nightstand now, empty of its secret, but I have not put it away. I keep it there the way you keep a compass after the journey it guided you through is finished. Not because you still need the direction, but because you've come to understand exactly how much you owed to having had it. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I have turned it over enough times now that I believe there is, it is this. Love left undocumented is not weaker than love written down. But love written down survives the people who forget, for a while, what it's supposed to mean. My wife loved me enough, 28 years before I ever needed it, to make sure that whatever happened after her, I would never be a man standing outside a locked door with nowhere left in this world that was legally, unshakably mine. That is not a cold thing, a document, a page number in a dusty book in a courthouse basement. That is the most enduring kind of love there is, the kind that keeps showing up for you long after the person who wrote it down is gone. I am 63 years old. I buried my wife on a Monday, and by Friday my own son had the locks changed on my house. I want you to know that I do not tell you this story so you'll be angry at him on my behalf, though I understand if some of that anger comes anyway. I tell you this story because somewhere out there, tonight, there is another quiet man or woman sitting at a kitchen table they've stopped using, wondering whether the people they raised will remember. When it matters most, everything that quiet giving was worth. I cannot promise you they will. I can only tell you what I told my own son, sitting on his grandfather-in-law's old bench, at the edge of the water his mother loved best. It is never too late to put down the weight you've been carrying and finally ask for help, honestly. And it is never too late for the people who love you to choose, even after everything, to help you carry it.